Hey, what's up everybody? It's Crawl, and due to my lack of progress on Whips Only, it's getting there, I promise. I'm right at the end, it's gonna be out soon. I'm going to make a filler video, making a tier list of every boss and event boss in Terraria. But let's get straight into it. So, first up, we have the pre-hard mode bosses and event bosses. There's only one event boss in pre-hard mode, but we're ranking these based on stuff like difficulty, fun factor, are their drops good, all combined together, and to see if it makes it worth it. So first things first is King Slime. King Slime is a boss that you can often never fight in a playthrough. Usually it's not that worth it. The Slimy Saddle actually has a lot of good uses. You can even use it in hard mode against like the Empress of Light, but at that point you have a much better option with the Queen Slime's mount. So straight off the bat, I'm gonna say King Slime is probably a C tier boss. Throwing doesn't exist anymore. The ninja armor is just not that great. The expert mode drop is not good. I should also preface, these are all gonna be based on expert mode difficulty, but his expert mode drop just isn't good, and the Slimy Saddle is his best drop, and it's more rare, and there's a better option once you get to hard mode when you might actually start using it a whole lot. So we're gonna put King Slime in C tier. He's an easy boss to fight, at least. Next up, the Eye of Cthulhu is actually, I'm gonna say borderline S tier, but I'm gonna say A because it only drops the Shield of Cthulhu, and while it's an accessory that I use for almost the entire game, there is, once in hard mode, you can grind out for the Master Ninja gear, which gives you a better dash and the chance to dodge. So if that didn't exist, I'd probably put Eye of Cthulhu in S. The fight is actually really fun. I wouldn't call it difficult at all. The Eater of Worlds, I think I'm gonna put also an A. I think the Eater of Worlds is actually a really easy fight. It can be difficult if you don't have a lot of defense and you get hit a lot. The drops include, like the Worm Scarf, which is a really good drop. 17% damage reduction, I believe, something like that. If you're pretty skilled at the game, you're gonna try not to get hit as often as possible. But it's really good for that reason. And I'm gonna say the same goes for the Brain of Cthulhu. I feel like you can't really separate these two bosses unless you really just like the Brain of Confusion more. And it's a really good accessory as well. But I think probably I would say on par with the Worm Scarf, depending on who you are. Queen Bee. I think the Queen Bee has to go in B. The Queen Bee is a fight that is not too hard. You can make the summons very easily, and you get the Witch Doctor, who supplies you with a lot of stuff, but that doesn't come from the Queen Bee herself. You do get stuff like the Bee's Knees, which is a really great bow. The Bee Gun and Bee Nades are also fantastic items, especially if you're in a magic or ranged playthrough. You can easily take care of the wall with some Bee Nades. But overall, like the Honeyed Goggles, the flight mount, isn't infinite flight because it's a pre-hard mode boss. It is also incredibly rare, and you do get the stuff to make the Bee Armor as well, and the Bee Summon. I mean, she drops a lot of good stuff. I just don't think it's really worth farming, especially as a mage. There's better things you can go for, and also you don't get a whole lot besides the Bee Gun, which might not even drop. I think overall her stuff's spread out very wide, which is really good. She's right in the middle, I think. None of her drops are too crazy, and none of them are too weak. Now Skeletron. Now defeating Skeletron gives you the dungeon, which is great. All of his drops are borderline useless though. I think Skeletron has to be the first F tier boss. He's incredibly easy to fight. Even on some of the hardest challenges, all you have to do is fight the time more than anything. He's not very fun, and the only drop he really drops that could be used is the Book of Skulls, and I'm not considering unlocking the dungeon as a drop here or anything. It's a bonus, but overall, he's F tier. If you don't have something you need in the dungeon besides like the Cobalt Shield, you wouldn't even really need to do it. Moving on, Deerclops. I think I've fought Deerclops a couple of times. And Deerclops' items are okay. Lucy the Axe is a really good axe, but now that the Axe of Regrowth is in the game, there's kind of no point. He has a really good magic item and a sentry. I'm gonna put Deerclops in C tier. You guys can tell me if I'm wrong about this in the comments, but I don't fight Deerclops enough to really know if he's that worth fighting. He's also hard to fight. If you don't make the summoner, he has a chance to randomly spawn. And he's not too hard of a difficulty wise, but I don't know, I just feel like his drops maybe aren't worth that much and nothing really of value you can get from him. Let's do the Wall of Flesh first before going into the events. The Wall of Flesh, I am going to put, I think the Wall of Flesh is an S tier boss. In expert mode, you get the Demon Heart, which is just fantastic. Gives you an extra accessory slot for a max of 6 or 7 if you're playing in master mode. which is just crazy. It's a massive power boost once you get into hard mode. The fight itself is actually rather difficult depending on what you are. If you're a mage, it can be a breeze. Even melee now, if you're using swords, it can be a breeze. But stuff like summoner, with the early game whips not being super fantastic, it's actually a really hard challenge. But the drops for it are so worth it, and it leads you in that gateway into hard mode. I think the Wall of Flesh is an S tier boss, and all of its hard mode weapon drops can give you a nice boost if you can use them. Next up, the Dark Mage. I'm gonna put the Dark Mage in F tier. It's unfortunate. The Dark Mage really doesn't drop a whole lot, and the Old One's Army event is not one that a lot of people enjoy very frequently, having to grind out and get through this guy multiple times. He drops a couple of pets, and they're cool pets, but they don't really do anything for you in the long run, which sucks. First up in the hardwood bosses, we have Queen Slime. I think Queen Slime deserves a spot in A tier, actually. I was gonna put her in B, just above King Slime, but the Queen Slime saddle with the wings is a fantastic option against stuff like Fishron, stuff like Empress of Light. It's amazing. You can use it for pretty much the entire game. It really gives you that fall speed that you really need in those fights for quick movement. As well as if you're a summoner, you get the Blade Staff, and the Blade Staff is crazy good. The Crystal Assassin set, or whatever it is, I have never used, but I'm pretty sure it's actually not terrible. It's actually a really decent set. If you're just going for like an odd build, the Crystal Assassin set can be pretty decent, but I think the Blade Staff, one of the best early summons you can get, is actually probably worth it, as well as that the Slimy Saddle that you can get from her. Now, the mech bosses are only going to be separated here by difficulty, I think. I'm going to put the twins in B. You get the Hallowed Bars, which is actually really great, and they're not the hardest of the bosses. I'll put the Destroyer also in B here, just because if you have the right setup, the Destroyer can be a breeze. If not, you can actually take a lot of damage really quickly. And Skeletron Prime, I think actually might have a spot in A or high B. It feels wrong to separate these guys, actually. I'm gonna put all mech bosses in B because they pretty much drop the same thing, but Skeletron Prime is arguably and noticeably the easiest of the mech bosses in my opinion, which lets you you can focus on farming him to get your hallowed armor set and then take out the other two. It's pretty nice. Only reason I would consider Skeletron Prime the best of the 3 mech bosses is how easy he is to farm. Next up, we have Plantera. Now, Plantera actually drops a couple of items, none of which I think are super fantastic. She drops the Jungle Temple key as well, but I'm gonna put Plantera as a boss. She's kind of fun. She's a little difficult if you're not prepared. With a big enough arena, you can just circle around Plantera no problem, and it's not a big deal. I don't know, I kind of like Plantera. She's a difficult enough fight. She can do a lot of damage. And if you don't over-prepare, she can actually really take you out quick. And she does have stuff, like the Seedler, which is, an ingredient for the Zenith far off in the future, so you need that if you want to go for that. Stuff like the Venus Magnum is really great for gun playthroughs, so I'm gonna keep her in B as well. Next up, we have Golem. Golem is actually, I think they've buffed Golem a lot because he's notoriously one of the easiest bosses in the game. I actually want to consider Golem an A-tier boss. I think Golem's an A-tier boss. Not because of how fun he is to fight, it's actually a rather annoying fight, but it's not too difficult if your temple arena lets it be. But his drops are crazy. You get one of the best pickaxes and axes in the game with the pick saw. The possessed hatchet for if you're using boomerangs or something is actually really great. The stinger is actually really good if you need to take care of some big groups of enemies. Golem, I really like Golem's weapon drops, and I think that and how easy he is to farm gets you into A tier. He also gives you the beetle husk for beetle armor for melee players, and that's just amazing. Finally, again, we have Duke Fishron, one of my favorite bosses in the game to fight. If you've seen my bows only playthrough, you know that I have taken this guy out pre-mechs. Fairly difficult, but I'm gonna put Duke Fishron obviously in S tier. He supplies you with the best wings in the game, a decent enough summon with the Tempest Staff. It's not the best you can get. The Sanguine Staff is just amazing. The Shrimpy Truffle is an excellent mount if you can utilize it well. The Flare-On is absolutely amazing. The Tsunami is the single best bow in the game, I believe. I really like the Vortex bow, but the Tsunami is just so good, and you can get it so early and just break the game progression. It's so fun to do. I highly recommend next time you play a Ranger, go for a pre-mech Fishron fight. Empress of Light, one of the toughest fights in the game for me. It's because I don't do it a whole lot. Where do I want to put the Empress of Light? I think the Empress is also an S tier boss. I think the pure difficulty of it, she keeps the same pattern no matter how you fight her. and it's just really solid. It's a fun fight, requires a lot of thinking and movement and proactive damage. I really love that fight, and in my current whips only playthrough, I have been struggling with this one a whole lot. I think it's worth it in the end. The Kaleidoscope is insane. If you can beat her in daytime, you get the best summon in the game, the Terra Prisma, as well as her extra mode drop, the Soaring Insignia, that lets you have infinite flight. Is just absolutely insane. Definitely an S tier boss. Next up, the Lunatic Cultist, I'm gonna put straight down in F tier. The fight is not fun. If you manage to fail the fight, which has happened to me on a couple occasions, you have to wait a full day cycle before you can fight them again. You have to slow down your fight pace and make sure you hit the right clones. It's a nice breakup in the fight, but overall I think it's not great. The only drops you get from it are the Ancient Manipulator, which don't even come into use until after you've beaten the game. And finally, the Moonlord. The Moonlord's very difficult for me because, you know, it's right on the end game. I don't play a lot of modded Terraria, so as soon as I beat the Moonlord, I'm done. It's a very challenging fight. If you don't nurse spam Moonlord, the fight becomes a lot more difficult. His drops are insane. Every weapon is really great, but because it's right at the end of the game, I think I have to move him to the B tier. I think the drops from the Moonlord are fantastic, and if you're playing modded, I think Moonlord actually goes up maybe to an A or an S tier just because of how good those drops are, but on vanilla Terraria, I think Moonlord's right in the middle. It's a nice fun challenge, but the drops are pretty much worthless at that point, unless you're playing past the end game. Next up, we have the hard mode event bosses, and we have a lot more than we did in pre-hard mode with just the Dark Mage. But right now, we're going to start off with the Ogre from the Old One's Army. I actually want to put Ogre, I think, right above Dark Mage. Old One's Army is one event that I have neglected a ton in my playthroughs, so I don't really know. Again, you can tell me if I'm wrong about any of these. Give me your own list in the comments. But I just genuinely, the Ogre has some decent drops that can actually help you, actual weapons compared to the Dark Mage, but overall I think the Old One's Army is not incredibly worth it until you get to tier 3 and Betsy arrives. I think Betsy is a B tier boss. The wings are fantastic. The point in the game that you're getting to Betsy, some of the weapons you can get outside of the Old One's Army are way better. But with stuff like, if you're using spears only, technically one of Betsy's drops is a spear, and it's actually really good. So depending on the playthrough, I think Betsy's actually right in the middle of B and A, depending on what you're playing. The wing upgrade's nice, but at that point, you can just go fight Fishron for a better set. Moving on to the Pumpkin Moon, we have the Mourning Wood. Now, the Mourning Wood actually, I really like. It's not a super hard event boss here, but the drops you can get from the Mourning Wood are fantastic. The Witch's Broom, Infinite Flight, I love it. The Spooky Twig, a nice little pet, and the Spooky Hook gives you, you know, a hook you don't really need at that point in the game. However, the Necromantic Scroll, a fantastic buff for summoners that you can then combine with the Hercules Beetle and get the Papyrus Scarab. It's really just, he's a big upgrade, and if you really want that Infinite Flight, it's not too bad because you can fight him multiple times through the event. Next up is the Pumpking. Following the Mourning Wood, the main boss of the Pumpkin Moon. He drops a lot of decently good stuff. He gives you like the Black Fairy Dust for some wings. At that point again, you can just get the Fishron wings. He drops the Dark Harvest, a decent whip for summoners that can actually match the Morningstar damage if you go for a full melee speed build, which can work, but I wouldn't recommend it. You just go for the Morningstar. But you can switch between them and get that melee speed buff on the Morningstar. It's actually really nice. The Raven Staff is a fantastic option for mages that can even bring you to the end of the Moonlord, which you can see in my Wands Only playthrough I used to actually take out the final boss of the game. Next up is the Everscream, starting the Frost Moon. The Everscream I'm going to put, I think, in C tier. The Frost Moon is notably not as good as the Pumpkin Moon, I think. The Everscream drops the Razor Pine, which is a really nice little wand for mages, but I think the Raven Staff is just better, and you can farm the Infinite Flight Broom from him. And overall, I think the Everscream's disappointing counterpart to the Mourning Wood. I don't think he has nearly as good drops. And moving on to the Sand Tank one, I think I'm similarly going to put him in C tier. You can get the tank mount from him, I believe, which is actually not terrible. It's a really strong, powerful mount, but at that point, you really want an Infinite Flight mount or something like the Queen Slime Saddle so that you can fight those really fast-moving drop speed bosses. Now we have the final boss of the Frost Moon, the Ice Queen. I genuinely think the Ice Queen is in all ways inferior to the Pumpkin. The Blizzard Staff is not great. The North Pole can be useful for those spears only playthroughs. The Snowman Cannon sucks. I genuinely think the reindeer's good. Okay, the reindeer bells are good. Overall, I think the Ice Queen might have to go in F. It's not a fun fight, and also the drops are not worth it. Something like the Pumpkin that has multiple viable weapons. The Ice Queen barely has any. Next up, we have the Flying Dutchman, the two event bosses that are kind of out there. I think the Flying Dutchman, unfortunately, is also an F tier boss. The reason I think the Flying Dutchman is also an F tier boss is, I don't know, it's just the pirates are not a fun event to fight. The Flying Dutchman is incredibly easy to beat if you have any kind of piercing. Stuff like the discount card and lucky coin are really amazing to get, but at that point, like, you know, there's better things that you could have for grinding, even just fighting bosses over and over again. Now, the Martian Saucer, I think, actually needs a little bit of talking about. I think I'm going to put the Martian Saucer right in B tier here. The Martian Madness event is actually rather difficult. The fight is not too bad if you can get the saucer by itself and recognize its pattern. It's very easy. It does supply something like summoners with the Xeno Staff, which is one of the best staffs in the game, and arguably, before the Stardust Dragons, it is the best staff to use against the Empress of Light or the Sanguine Staff, but the Martian Saucer, that's really great. The Laser Machine Gun isn't fantastic. The Electrosphere Launcher can have its uses somewhere. The Influx Waver, I think, is a terrible sword for the late game. Stuff like that. It's very middle of the road boss. It has one of the best summons in the game, but one of the worst melee weapons. It has a decent ranged weapon. Overall, I think the Martian Saucer is B just from how good the summons is. I don't know if that's biased. Maybe the Martian Saucer would be like right in between here. But just for the sake of it, we'll put Martian Saucer in B. Next up, we have the Pillars. Now, the Pillars, I will be ranking off of how difficult their enemies are and how difficult it is to get through them without dying, and how easy it is to cheese, and the weapons that they supply with their dust. The Solar Pillar, A tier. The Solar Pillar is one of the hardest pillars in the game. I think almost impossible to cheese. I'm sure there is some way to cheese it, and I'm sure I'm wrong, but this is definitely the hardest for me. But both of its weapons are some of the best melee weapons you can get in the entire game. Now, that is fantastic, and you can't say that for a lot of the other pillar weapons, but you almost always, if you're playing just a pure melee, want to grab both of these weapons. Next up, Vortex Pillar. I think Vortex Pillar is a C tier boss. I think the magic weapons that you can get from the Vortex Pillar are nowhere near as good as something like the Raven Staff, which has like this kind of auto-homing. They're powerful. Overall, you don't really see a lot of people using them. They're good for maybe big groups of enemies where you can like blast it through multiple. But overall, I think at this point in the game, something like the Raven Staff that you can get way earlier is just so much better than any of the Vortex Pillar items. Next up is the Vortex Pillar. Did I say Vortex for this one? Nebula. A Vortex Pillar, I'm going to put in B tier. I think the Vortex Pillar is right in the middle ground. You can easily cheese this boss, so it's not too hard. Just dig in the ground and hope that they don't blast you through it, and you can just easily sweep through all the enemies and defeat the boss. However, the drops you get with the Vortex Beater and the Phantasm are very solid. The Vortex Beater is a great gun, and the Phantasm is arguably on par with the Tsunami with how good it is. And finally, last boss on the tier list, the Stardust Pillar in A tier. This might be controversial because, as we all know, one of the easiest bosses to defeat in the event, you just grab some Stardust cells, lure them away, and have them constantly pop open, and you can just farm away that 100 kills you need. But the big elephant in the room here is the Stardust Cell Staff, which is notably one of the worst summons in the game. To balance that, the Stardust Dragon is almost borderline broken. If you watch my Summoner playthrough, I melt the Moonlord's eyes in maybe not even a full minute. It just absolutely shreds. It's the best summon to use against the Empress of Light, in my opinion. Especially Daytime Empress, you want to use it. I think the Stardust Dragon Staff is so powerful that it balances it out into A tier due to the ease of being able to get it and how strong it is. That wraps up all of our S tier bosses, our A tier bosses, our B tier bosses, our C tier bosses, and our F tier bosses. Let me know what you guys think in the comments. Give me your own tier list down below. I hope you guys enjoyed watching this. Don't worry, Whips Only will be out very soon. Just let me know what you think. Love you guys. Bye.